The common thread to the Nugan activities in Australia, the loans affair, are relating to the activities of Wackenhut, Cabazon Arms and Meridian Arms, and the links with the Gambino Mafia with the Cabazon Casino with Robert Booth Nichols. Also, the activities of Michael Riconosciuto, which has been documented, and leading, of course, as I mentioned before, was the murder and slaughter of Michael's business partner, the banker, Paul Maraska, who had the ability to move gold bullion and currencies through international banks. So Robert Booth Nichols appearing to threaten me in Australia in 2004 and telling me all my problems lead to Alexander Haig links to the common thread of Alexander Haig intervening to shut down the investigation of US Customs into the evidence that Peter Wiednieks had perjured himself during Michael Riconosciuto's trial. Given that Michael testified that Peter Wiednieks had delivered the PROMIS software to Wackenhut for him to modify, and given that Michael Riconosciuto testified in court, and also to myself in recorded interviews and by letters, that the CIA's modified PROMIS software was renamed the Lean software and sold to the Australian government. So the links with Australia are coming through Cabazon, Wackenhut, and Robert Booth Nichols, with the links that he has with the Gambino Mafia, but more importantly, his prominent role in setting up the $4 billion Arab loans affair to bring down the Australian democratically elected government headed by Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, and the destroying the credibility of Dr. Jim Cairns, given that they were opposing the use of CIA using the Echelon satellite communication network with NSA to spy on the cabinet, the government and cabinet of the Australian government. So Robert Booth Nichols is coming through very strongly as the common thread, and for his appearance in Australia linked to the Nugan Bank with Michael Hand, Wackenhut, Meridian Arms, plus my previous podcast showing that the mafia connections of the leading attorneys with the Gambino Mafia and also leading mafia in Las Vegas, is that it actually comes back to the Fidco board and his role with Frank Colucci, with Ted Shackley, William Colby and Henry Kissinger to set up the loans affair. So recapping that his link is definitively with Ted Shackley, link with Peter Wiednieks at Wackenhut with the PROMIS software, links with the mafia and the drug cartels of the mafia, the Medellin and Cali cartels, and also with the distribution of heroin and opium from the Golden Triangle with these links back to Cambodia, and also in Laos with Ted Shackley in the secret team, with Alexander Haig, and of course Michael Ledeen appearing the same day with Robert Booth Nichols when he made those threats against me. So recapping, your research is upsetting. Very powerful Israeli businessmen. You do not know whom you're dealing with until you receive a crowbar to the back of your head. If you continue with your investigations, then you will have the military coming down on you, or your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. So given that Robert Booth Nichols mysteriously appears in Australia with Michael Ledeen, and the SBS TV Dateline program, who he contacted in order to get my contact details and arrange the meeting with me, was exposing John Hopkins Institutions, Frank Bosnell, Director of Risk Assessments or Risk International, And Business Risk International, Inc., who employed Major Joseph Queller, who had urgently returned back from Kuwait after Desert Storm to bump into Danny Casolaro, and set up all the meetings, the fatal meeting for Danny Casolaro, believing that he was going to meet with Peter Vignics, given that Major Joseph Queller said that he knew the wife of Peter Vignics, Barbara Vignics, who worked as the Chief of Staff in Senator Byrd's office, together with his former fiancée/wife, who was also working for Barbara Vignics. So the common thread seems to be Peter Vignics, Joseph Queller, Robert Booth Nichols urgently returning from Kuwait, working with the Kuwait royal family to recover all their stolen gold bullion and art by the Saddam Hussein military forces during the invasion. The common thread being Major Joseph Queller, Robert Booth Nichols and Kuwait, who financed all those BCCI checks that Danny Casolaro was holding. So the links of these groups here, Robert Booth Nichols, Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig and Peter Vignics, is this links to the P2, Le Cercle 6I, and the P2 Lodge in Banca Ambrosiana, Nugenham Bank, BCCI, money laundering of drugs and arms. Peter Vignics' role, delivering the PROMIS tapes, and also the subject of what was called the Indochina Report, which I'll do a whole podcast on, and his association with Solomon Schwartz, a Mossad agent, and also with Dr. Earl Bryan, with the appropriate, and George Oaken, who's connected to the Gambino Mafia. So the Gambino Mafia link seems to be with George Oaken, who Danny Casolaro had contacted with Robert Booth Nichols' links, and also a link across to Peter Vignics and Earl Bryan. Alexander Haig steps in to shut down the investigation. There are too many coincidences to ignore with my investigation of PROMIS in Australia, Operation Still Point, to launder billions of dollars, in fact trillions of dollars of gold bullion through Citibank, Nugenham Bank and Banca Ambrosiana and the World Bank. And Project Hammer with Citibank. Too many coincidences. So we really have done a full circle here of investigations of PROMIS leading to all the people within what I would deem as a secret team of high-level officials who are using the Vatican as a holy alliance for their war against communism in Poland, Central America, Afghanistan, Eastern Europe, Africa, using the sale of drugs and arms illegally as the collateral that can be laundered through the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, Nugenham Bank, and other banks. So now we come to the part of Carlo Presenti. He's financing and represents the Cercle, called the Presenti Group by David Rockefeller in his briefing to Henry Kissinger, and the role of Zbigniew Brzezinski as the leading neocon, where all four of them jointly found the Trilateral Commission. This is an amazing development, and given that he backs neo-fascist groups and neo-Nazi groups linked across to Otto Skorzeny, a Nazi assassin, and activities in Spain, Chile, Central America, Vietnam, drugs and arms with the Nazis, and a trilateral commission that sets up, and as I have demonstrated previously in early parts of my podcast, it turns out that Jeffrey Epstein is a member of the trilateral commission as well, with the backing of the Rothschilds, and his links with the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who also had the PROMIS software. So we have definitive links coming to PROMIS software. So let's have a look at the role of Zabriskie. And yes, he's one of the founders of the Polish Knights of Malta, Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem and Malta. It was established in 1986. It is under the worldwide Knights of Malta. He's on the board of advisors and considered as one of the founders of the Polish Knights of Malta. So we have Ted Shackley with his Polish family background and speaks Polish, and his earlier roles under OSSS in debriefing Nazis serving in Poland. Gives him a very good link with the Nazi organisations, particularly their expertise in assassination and drugs and arms, and links back to Otto Skorzeny with Italy. Ted Shackley also based in Italy, in Rome. And of course Otto Skorzeny's high esteem held when he flew in and rescued Mussolini in a daring escape. And then his links directly with the Knights of Malta and the P2 Lodge with Lucia Gelli. So we really have an overlying thread of the founder of the Trilateral Commission are all Knights of Malta, members of the P2 Lodge, and also affiliated with the secret Catholic order and endorsed by Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and also the Cercle, and set up the 6i, a privately funded international intelligence agency. So in my previous podcasts, it's convincing that as one of the founders of the Cercle and affiliated with it is John Sinlaub with his Wackel Foundation, Peter Grace, representing America's branch of the Knights of Malta, founded AmeriCares, involved in the laundering of funds and arms and drugs with Oliver North, George Bush and Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Oliver North and Sinlaub in operations that they're doing in South America. Of course, Richard Viguerie, setting up the Council for National Policy, his links with Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, and Michael Ledeen, and Richard Secord, and Eric von Marboard. And then, of course, the NED Foundation, or the National Endowment for Democracy, or Project Democracy. And so we've come a full circle, is that it's actually been used internationally, with all these foundations being established as fronts for their illegal arms and drugs trafficking worldwide. And so this is what I found. 14 million medical aid been funneled to Central America, 1984. A private humanitarian organisation called AmeriCares Foundation, working with the Order of the Knights of Malta, has channeled more than 14 million in donated medical aid to El Salvador, Honduras and Guatemala over the last 2 years. The bulk of supplies, worth about 10 million, has gone to hospitals and clinics in El Salvador, according to AmeriCares founder and president Robert C. McCauley. But part of the $680,000 in aid to Honduras went to Miskito, Indians linked to US-backed rebels, fighting the leftist government of Nicaragua, according to a Knights of Malta official in Honduras. Much of the $3.4 million in Americare's medical aid to Guatemala has been distributed through the armed forces as part of its resettlement program of model villages aimed at defeating leftist insurgents, said official Guatemalan businessman Roberto Alajos. It goes on to say that prominent in the US end of the operation are businessmen J. Peter Grace, head of W.R. Grace Conglomerate and chairman of American Division of the Knights of Malta, and attorney Prescott Bush Jr., brother of Vice President Bush, former Treasury Secretary William Simon, and Macaulay, a New Canaan, Connecticut businessman. So we now have confirmation that William Simon is not only a director of Hellenetics with Chuck Missler and Robert Gray for the Star Wars program, but President Bush Jr., brother of President Bush, is involved with William Simon and Peter Grace in the Americares Foundation. Among the 1,750 US members of the Knights are CIA Director William Casey, former Secretary Alexander Haig Jr., and former Secretary of Health and Education Welfare Joseph A. Califano. And that name's very important. Joseph A. Califano did meet with William Hamilton in relation to his investigations of CIA stealing his PROMIS software. Although they apparently are not involved in Americare's effort, former National Security Affairs Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski is honorary chairman of Americare's board of directors. Isn't that amazing that we come back to, he sets up the Trilateral Commission and he's spearheading the Cercle 6I and secret Catholic order with the P2, Vatican Bank and Banca Ambroso, with all of the people connected with the mafia. So you can see there's consistency here in using the Knights of Malta and all of its foundations that it's establishing as a front for supplying arms and money laundering drugs with the Iran-Contra. So, in addition to that, based in Rome, a devoutly Roman Catholic order has 10,000 members in 42 nations, and it's recognised diplomatically as the world's only sovereign nation without territory. Don't you love that term? Knights of Malta, a special Roman Catholic order of 42 nations, 10,000 members, and recognised diplomatic with its own passports as world's only sovereign nation without territory. It has ambassadors in 40 countries. Medical aid thus can be moved through diplomatic pouches into needy countries without going through customs, Grace said in an interview. I think there it is. That's how you money launder gold. That's how you money launder drugs. And that's how you move weapons in the guise of aid, medical aid. Isn't it good, the alliance, the Holy Alliance for God's mission to sell drugs and arms to terrorists and neo-fascist and neo-Nazi dictators who are oppressing all this poor people. It goes on to say that Macaulay said his foundation has received donations from the top 40 or 50 US medical companies which can deduct such contributions. So they not only set it up for money laundering, but it gives a tax deduction to the very rich. And that is coming through very loud and clear in the investigations we're finding, is that they do set up foundations, they set up the Federal Reserve, they charge interest for money that they don't have, but governments issue bonds no money really exists, but agrees that it's going to raise taxes as assets to pay for those bonds. And so the bonds and the money's not real, it's the future taxes. So the taxpayers of Australia and USA and UK and other countries, well, Canada and other countries worldwide, are being charged interest for bonds on their taxes that they're going to pay and have no choice but to pay. So it looks like you get hit twice. You get hit with the taxes and you get hit with the debt that's incurred. So he goes on to say, he said he has received, it says here, just going back, he said America Cares has shipped $28 million in medical aid to trouble spots since incorporating in 1982. Look at the timing of that. And that it has just one paid employee, a secretary bookkeeper. Isn't that amazing? One person employed. All other labour is donated, he said, and funds are raised only to cover transportation, packing and shipping costs. He said he has received 10% of his funds from, wait for it, Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network, mostly during the campaign to aid Afghanistan or Afghan refugees. In my previous podcast, I proved that $250 million through Capcom of money laundering of Noriega's drugs was being moved through Telecommunications Inc. or Telecommunications International Inc., TCI, in the BCCI report as suspicious transactions related to laundering Noriega's drugs, and they're the business partner and provide the broadcasting network for Pat Robertson. We also have a podcast previously that I covered that Lester Coleman, who witnessed the PROMIS software being delivered in Cyprus, Nicosia, was working for Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network and missions in Lebanon and in Cyprus, had witnessed all of these things related to the Pan Am 103 bombing that killed the McKay team, key team, and CIA chief of Lebanon, returning with evidence that Ted Shackley's and Richard Secord's secret team was involved with transporting heroin into the USA from Lebanon. However, at least one pro-government group, the Air Commando Association of Fort Walton Beach, Florida, claims to have used the Knights of Malta warehouse in El Salvador. Retired General H.C. Aderholt, a name that you will be familiar with these relationships with Ted Shackley, Operation Phoenix and John Singlaub, head of 1,500 member group, told Stone that the commandos delivered food and medicine to the Knights facilities and that together they get good support from the Salvadorian Air Force commander. General Aderholt said the association has distributed to El Salvador $4.5 million in food and medicine provided by the, here we go, Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network and World Medical Relief. He said Liberals in Congress have tried to tie to some sinister plan with the CIA, which he said is incorrect. The evidence seems to dictate otherwise. Yet a panel that met at the Defense Department this month urged the United States to move away from conventional warfare tactics in El Salvador and to apply the lessons of counterinsurgency warfare, including increased civic action. And surprise, surprise, Sunday, March 15th, 87, the newspapers discover, for the first time, evidence leading to President Bush, or Vice President Bush at the time. Staff minimises Vice President's role. Turns out the cast of characters George Bush denied letter he sent was unusual. These are the key figures who became involved in a letter sent from Vice President Bush to Dr. Mario Castiglione. He says the characters involved are Dr. Mario Castiglione. Guatemalans sought to aid Contras. Jeb Bush was involved. Forward Castiglione's letter to his father. Henry Worley, Maryland attorney. Philip Hughes, Bush aide, arranged meeting with North. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, directly involved, met with Castiglione at White House. John Singlaub, directly involved, subject of arms shipment probe. Robert Owen, North's aide, recruited the doctors. Theodore Shackley, head of TGS International, is directly involved, and his co-director, which I'm going to do a whole podcast on, is Nozia Razmaro, an officer in Shackley's firm. He's actually a director and former SAVAK, head of SAVAK in Egypt, son of former Prime Minister of Iran. And you're going to love what Bush says when he was the director of CIA. He's the vice president, knows Ted Shackley personally, knows the prime ministers of Iran and the history of Iran, and you'll claim that he doesn't even know who Nozia Razmara is. Unbelievable denial, and the journalists never pursued that matter. So Nozia Razmara is directly involved, and he's a full director of TGS International that has contracts with the Kuwait royal family to develop a warehouse with Navy storage directly in the 1980s right through to early 1991, July 91, where there are court cases of a dispute with the US government over delays in payment for that contract with the Kuwait royal family, with the Kuwait government and Ted Shackley himself. And don't you find that an amazing coincidence that these people are the key people that Danny Casolaro is investigating, and he's holding the BCCI checks financed by the Kuwait royal family? And another person involved with this Doctor's Aid program endorsed by Vice President George Bush himself is Kenneth Dietz, Maryland security consultant, and Keith Hall, former CIA official. And so Bush recommends meeting with Oliver North. This is a passage from George Bush's 1985 letter to Dr. Mario Castiglione. The letter appears entirely inside. George Bush, Dr. Castiglione, he says, Vice President says, I might suggest, if you are willing, that you consider meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the President's National Security Council staff at a time that would be convenient for you. My staff have been in contact with Lieutenant Colonel North concerning your projects, and I know that he will be most happy to see you. Signed, sincerely, George Bush, Vice President. So this is the smoking gun of the relationship between Oliver North, Ted Shackley's company TGS International, and co-director Nozia Razmara. So we now have definitive proof. TGS International director Ted Shackley and Nozia Razmara, head of SAVAK, son of a former assassinated Prime Minister of Iran, linked with George Bush. And I'm going to show you that head of Israeli intelligence was training SAVAK in propaganda and also repressing and shutting down dissidents, together with Ed Wilson and Ted Shackley, and they're linked to Gorbnafar, who worked for SAVAK, who was introduced to Ted Shackley by Michael Ledeen. And then we're going to show you a famous movie actor who's embroiled in Iran-Contra scandal with them. So let's explore. And here's a picture of the young son of former Prime Minister of Iran, Nozar Razmara, director of TGI, but here's a photograph of him back in 1951 attending university in the USA and studying and hearing about the slaying and assassination of his father as the Prime Minister of Iran. Do you find that a denial by Vice President George Bush to the media that he doesn't even know who this man is, never met him before, never heard of him, can be true? Well, Vice President Bush arranged for Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North to meet with pro-Contra leader from Guatemala in 1985 when all US assistance to the Contras was being banned by Congress. A letter from Bush obtained by Miami Herald introduced the Guatemalan into North's network of former military and government officials currently under investigation in the Iran-Contra scandal. It is the first documentary evidence linking Bush to North and the secret network North forged to aid the Iran-Contras. Bush was responding to a letter from Dr. Mario Castellon, a political leader from Guatemala City, requesting US support for an international medical brigade to help the rebels fighting in Nicaragua. The letter from Castellon was passed on to the Vice President by his son, Jeb Bush, in Miami. And there's a copy of the entire letter. Here is a picture of Nozar Razmara, director of TGS International, with Ted Shackley, with all their contracts with the Kuwait royal family and Kuwait government at the time that Danny CASOLARO is murdered. And here's a picture of his father, the 33rd Prime Minister of Iran, in office from 26th of June 1950 to the 7th of March 1951. And it says here that Haj Ali Razmara was a military leader and Prime Minister of Iran. He was assassinated in 1951. Now, you can't be the the director of CIA in the 70s, leading up to the Iran crisis, the hostages, the deposing of the Shah, and you don't know who the Prime Ministers of Iran were, and that one of the directors of Ted Shackley's companies is the son. Al Razmara came closer than any other Prime Minister to ratifying the supplemental oil agreement between Iran and, wait for it, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Haj Ali Razmara was in office at the direct urging of the British Foreign Office and the AIOC, that's the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, to the Shah. In 1954, AIOC was renamed again to the British Petroleum Company, one of the antecedents of modern BP, British Petroleum Public Limited Company. Under pressure from the United States, British Petroleum was forced to accept membership in a consortium of companies which would bring Iranian oil back on the international market. So, for George Bush, as Vice President, former Director of CIA, and owning oil companies, international oil companies, with George Bush Jr., they knew who Nozar Razmara really was. This consortium of companies at various stages came to be known as the super majors, the Seven Sisters, or the Consortium for Iran Cartel. So these are the links that George Bush has with Ted Shackley and with Iran and the Kuwait royal family. Now remember, when Ted Shackley was forced to resign from CIA, it was George Bush that opened the doors for him to establish TGS International with the Kuwait royal family. So its business operations are in Kuwait, established by Vice President George Bush himself. Bush sent doctor to North Network. So if we go on, the article clearly says the following: before it was submitted for funding, a copy of the report was hand-delivered to a Virginia firm called TGS International Limited. According to Wally and Dietz, the former security consultant, TGS is an Arlington firm whose name is the initials of its president, Theodore G. Shackley, the retired CIA official who served as chief of covert operations when Bush headed CIA in 1976. TGS is a private company that builds modular warehouses around the world, Shackley says. Seems convenient if you're going to be exporting drugs and arms. Wally said he sent the report through Dietz to TGS so it would be quietly forwarded to the CIA for back-channel approval of the plans. The concern was the medical section inside the agency of CIA would review it, Castleton's plans, for competency. Whaley said, "I'm willing to state the information was passed or attempted to be passed to the CIA to get a competency rating." Dietz, who said he was a frequent visitor to the TGS offices owned by Ted Shackley and Nozvar Razmara, said he delivered the report at Whaley's request to TGS Vice President, wait for it, Nozvar Razmara. So not only is he a director of TGS, but he's the Vice President of TGS. So Razmara was a key official in the regime of the late Shah of Iran. Now we get to the part that's undeniable. It turns out that the research that I've uncovered is Nozvar Razmara, I've got all the documents to prove it, was actually head of SAVAK in Egypt, whilst Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, and all of his team with Turple are involved in the training of security for Sadat. Hank Whaley asked me to pass on 2 booklets to Nozvar Razmara because he wanted them to filter back to CIA. Dietz said I took the books to Razmara and left both copies with him. Now, in addition to the link of Bush, you're going to love this. Iranian arms dealing hearing in December 1986, the movie actor Nico Minardis is photographed outside the Southern District Federal Court in New York City after hearing on his Iranian arms deal case. Minardis was one of the celebrated defendants in a case related to the Iran-Contra affair, resulting from Minardis' business association with Saudi arms merchant Adnan Khashoggi. So now we get down to the integration of all these groups. Minardis was caught in an FBI sting operation in New York and was indicted by the US Attorney, don't you love this, Rudy Giuliani, on charges of conspiracy to illegally ship arms to Iran. 17 men of 6 nationalities have been placed under arrest or hand warrants issued against them in New York for conspiring to sell Iran several hundred F-4 and F-5 jet fighters. Don't you love that? Several hundred F-4 and F-5 jet fighters, 15,000 TOW air-to-air missiles, 15,000 of them, and scores of ranks as well as helicopters, long-range artillery and a C-130 military transport planes. Now this is going to blow your mind open because Danny Casolaro was investigating Ted Shackley and all his links with these deals. The US government says the weapons were to be delivered in Greek ships and were presently stored in Israel and several other countries. So it turns out that he's working with Adnan Khashoggi and Ted Shackley, Nosva Masmara, and Gorbanafar, who was former SAVAK agent. And there was an article by those shadowy arm traders, Adnan Khashoggi and his links with the movie actor. So SAVAK, this is the part that's really of importance. SAVAK Intelligence and Security Organisation of the country was the secret police, domestic security and intelligence service in Iran during the reign of the Shah and his dynasty. It was established by Mohammad Reza Shah with the help of US Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and Mossad. And this is the overlap now for the whole Iran-Contra scandal, going all the way to George Bush, Oliver North, Ted Shackley, and the son of the former Prime Minister of Iran, who was head of SAVAK in Egypt. SAVAK operated from 1957 until the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when the Prime Minister ordered its dissolution during the outbreak of Iranian Revolution. SAVAK has been described as Iran's most hated and feared institution prior to the revolution of 1979 because of its practice of torturing and executing opponents of the Pahlavi regime. SAVAK had the power to censor the media, screen applicants for government jobs, and according to reliable Western sources, use all means necessary, including torture, to hunt down dissidents. And this is the role of Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, and Frank Turple, together with Mossad. And here's the key. Yaakov Nimrodi is an Israeli businessman and former Israeli intelligence officer. Nimrodi, the father of Nimrodi, has been the chairman of Ma'ariv, which he acquired in 1992. But Nimrodi was born in Baghdad and grew up in poverty with 9 siblings after his family immigrated to Palestine. Nimrodi joined the Palmach in 1948 as an intelligence officer and later the Mossad. And in 1956 was appointed the IDF military attaché and Israel Defense Ministry representative in Tehran. There he was involved in Israel's large-scale arms sales to Iran in the 1960s. No Israeli representative in Iran during the Shah's regime was more significant or influential than Nimrodi. During his time, Nimrodi provided advice and training to Iran's SAVAK secret service. Nimrodi returned to Israel after the fall of the Shah of Iran in 1979, but continued to be involved in arms trading, including a $135 million sale of arms to Iran in 1981. Nimrodi's arms merchant, former Israeli intelligence agent, military attaché in Tehran, he was an associate of Khashoggi and Gorbanafar, and was one of the early middlemen in the arms sales to Iran. Nimrodi played a central role in the early stages of the Iran-Contra affair. And that's when you find from Blonde Ghost, Ted Shackley and his CIA Crusades by David Corn. In his book Blonde Ghost, David Corn wrote that Shackley viewed Kuwait as a tremendous source of profits. Those profits appeared to be tied to the Kuwait royal family. In 1982, the year the Kuwait Airlines was incorporated in Washington, don't you like this? The year that it was incorporated in Washington, the Kuwaiti government specifically requested the US Navy award Shackley's firm TGS International Inc. a $1.2 million contract to rehabilitate a warehouse for the Kuwaiti Air Force. Here is the link of all roads lead to Kuwait. The Martinsburg Police report clearly writes down that Danny CASOLARO had met a girlfriend of Ted Shackley at a party on the 4th of July, and she went home with him with a friend after the party, and later that night Danny CASOLARO caught her secretly going through all his research records and evidence on BCCI. Toward the end of 1983, Shackley's company, TGS International Inc., signed a $6.3 million deal with the US Navy to perform construction at the Ali Al Salem Air Base. I have all the reports on this as definitive evidence and internal reports from the US Navy confirming TGS appointment for these contracts, 40 miles outside the Kuwait City. I also have all the court cases that Ted Shackley had in January 1991, several months before Danny CASOLARO was murdered, and July and October 91, several months after, where Ted Shackley's company TGS had a legal dispute with the US government, Navy, over delays in payments for their contracts with the Kuwait royal family and government in Kuwait. So there's your direct link back to the Kuwait royal family and Ted Shackley. But that part is Kuwait Airlines was incorporated and contracted TGS International, and the chairman of Kuwait Airlines was the director of BCCI, who was indicted in July 1991, only 4 weeks before Danny CASOLARO was found murdered. And the BCCI checks financed by him and the Kuwait royal family were missing with the briefcase of Danny CASOLARO. Shackley continued working in Kuwait by way of another of his ventures called Research Associates International, which specialised in risk assessment by providing intelligence to business interests. And as you can see, TGS directors and research associates are involved with Cercle and 6i. Shackley also testified that Research Associates International was a security company. Its primary customers were Trans World Oil, run by a Dutch citizen named John Doos. The work involved smuggling oil into South Africa in violation of the embargo. And so, as we go through the evidence, as I touched on, Nico Minardis, the movie actor. Here is the press release, or the newspaper media, exposing his links with Michael the Dean, Khashoggi, Manager Gorbanafar, Oliver North, Yakov Nimrodi. Have a look at this for the cast. So now we have a direct link of all the parties around Danny CASOLARO's checks and were the key players in Cercle, 6i, and also involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. And it says here in December 3rd, 1986, it says, White House crisis, the Washington uproar, a cast of characters. Nico Minardis, a defendant in a New York case alleging plot to sell arms to Iran, said he thought he had official backing. Yakov Nimrodi, Israeli arms dealer, worked out arrangements for shipments of US arms that preceded the release of the hostage Benjamin Weir. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, dismissed as aide to National Security Advisor and returned to active duty, identified as architect of plan to transfer Iran arms sale money to Contras through Swiss bank accounts. Manager Gorbanafar, exiled Iranian businessman said to have raised issue of trading parts to Iran for hostages. Adnan Khashoggi, Saudi billionaire, arms dealer and businessman who met several times with Mr. McFarlane on Iran arms deal. And David Kimchi, former Director General of Israeli Foreign Ministry, he met with manager Gorbanifar and Michael Ledeen, who was a consultant to National Security Council on possibility of better US relations with Iran. It also highlights the other Al Schwimmer, Richard Secord, Robert McFarlane, William Cooper, Max Gomez, Eugene Hassifas, aerial delivery specialist captured by Sandinistas after C-123 or 130 was shot down. He said he made 4 previous flights into Nicaragua before being captured, but cannot confirm reports the flights had ties to CIA. Admiral John Poindexter, and Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, and a leader of militants that held 52 Americans for 44 days in Tehran, who reportedly received Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and Robert McFarlane in Iran with Muhammad Ali Haji. Now, here is the definitive overlap with Robert Sensi. Robert Sensi was involved directly with the matters involving Muhammad Ali as part of the negotiations for the release of the hostages in his testimony, and that's the reason the Kuwait royal family tried to distance itself from financing the BCCI checks, because it involved all of the Israelis, and Kuwait didn't have diplomatic channels and relationships with Israel and was worried about the ramifications in the Muslim world. So here is the definitive proof. The Cercle 6I members, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, TGS International, Research Associates International, as members of the Cercle and 6I. Their links to the Holy Alliance with P2 Lodge, Banca Ambrosiana, Nugenhan Bank, BCCI. The evidence is overwhelming. This was the $2 billion brokers of death deal that Danny Casolaro had, the handwritten memos confirming that they've been discovered by customs and names the customs agents. And they're now advising they're now shutting down all the CIA front companies in Singapore, the Israeli front companies in Singapore, the French intelligence front companies in Singapore, and then asks, what does Oliver North want to do with Noriega's drug contacts? Danny Casolaro had the BCCI checks and he had copies of the handwritten memos, and I'm going to do a podcast, but I've got the complete records of all the memos and correspondence that Oliver North tried to destroy that was recovered in the archives, confirming that he was being tipped off by a former FBI agent working at NSC about the customs bust and the parties involved and the embarrassment that this is going to cause. I'll do a complete podcast on it, because that is the definitive link of Oliver North and Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, directly linked with Noriega's drug contacts and the $2 billion brokers of death deal. More importantly, one of the members involved is the former CIA agent that flew to Israel, sponsored by Michael Ledeen, with Jinsa. I'll do a whole podcast on this. Sponsored by Jinsa to meet with Rafi Aden direct. And I have all of his interviews and his papers and publications and meetings, interviewing raffiating about their war in Syria and ability to use drones and the AWACS for destroying the MiG fighters. The original purpose of PROMIS software being used with aerostats, drones and AWACS. So we now have independent, definite evidence that the secret team was setting up under the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, Masonic orders, their foundations and charities for selling drugs and arms with a far-right religious fanatics, Pat Robertson, the Moonies, and the self-righteous Peter Grace, where the Knights of Malta are a state to themselves. Their loyalty is to no nation. It has diplomatic privileges and passports, and it can move anywhere worldwide without going through customs. And so if we go on a bit further, and we look now at the details of what did Vice President say in his letter. The letter said to link Vice President to North's Contra supply network. It says here, Caseljon, a Guatemalan city pediatrician who heads the National Conservative Party in Guatemala and is currently campaigning for president, requested US help in setting up an international medical brigade to help the Contras, according to the Herald. The newspaper, in its Sunday edition, characterised the letter as the first documentary evidence linking Vice President Bush to North and the secret network he forged to aid the Contras. A North National Security Council staff member was dismissed November 25th for his role in the Iran-Contra affair. It looks like Vice President's cutting them all loose because this is the smoking gun. It goes on to say that the Herald quoted Henry H. Whaley, a Maryland attorney and former international arms dealer, as saying that at the request of intelligence community contacts and a Guatemalan contact, he introduced Caseljon to Contra supporters in Washington. And here we go. Whaley said he made the introductions after Caseljon received the Bush letter because he assumed the CIA had cleared the doctor's credentials. He said Caseljon subsequently met in Washington with Contra leader Adolfo Calero and retired Major General John K. Singlaub, head of private group that was aiding the rebels, which is the Wackle group. And hence its links with the Cercle, 6i, and NED, National Endowment Foundation for Democracy and Project Democracy. The Herald quoted sources as saying Bush's letter and a list of medical supplies needed by Caseljon was sent by Whaley to TGS International, a firm headed by Ted Shackley, was head of the covert operations at CIA when Bush was CIA director. And now we come to the really interesting bit. Bush sent Doctor to North Network, but it says CIA link was denied. So let's look at that. TGS official Shackley and Razmara denied any link to CIA. Razmara denied that the Caseljon report was ever given to him at the TGS office, and he adamantly denied any contact with Bush. He, George Bush, has never been in this complex, Shackley said. We have absolutely nothing to do with the CIA. We have absolutely nothing to do with the CIA. I deny I have received a copy of the report under any circumstances from anybody. Razmara said he and Shackley also denied statements from Herald sources that Bush had visited the TGS offices. It goes on, it was Shackley and Razmara who held the initial meeting in November 1984 with manager Gorbanifar in Hamburg. Now, isn't that interesting? It was Shackley and Razmaro, head of SAVAK in Egypt, son of former Prime Minister of Iran, with manager Gorbachev in Hamburg, West Germany, to discuss the ransoming of US hostages held in Iran. Gorbachev later became a key Iranian middleman in the ill-fated trading of US weapons for hostages. Now remember that Gorbachev was a former SAVAK agent. He's meeting with Razmara, who was head of SAVAK in Egypt, as the representative of the Shah of Iran. Whaley, and Maryland attorney and former arms dealer involved with Castlejohn, said that his past dealings with Razmara had convinced him that TGS was a conduit for information to CIA. A retired Marine officer who said he maintained contacts in Pentagon and the CIA, Whaley, 40, said, "There's no doubt in my mind TGS had some connection to the CIA. It's not a think tank. It's an operational group. I do not know, Whaley," Razmara said. "This is complete lie by this man." And then other witnesses come forward to the media. Dietz and Keith Hall, a former CIA officer, both said Razmara subsequently asked Dietz to contact firms that could design and sell equipment similar to that sought by Castlejohn, and described in the report. Hull said he was present with Dietz in Razmara's office when the request was made. "I was with Keith Dietz in the office of TGS talking to Novza Razmara," Hall said. He said Razmara asked Dietz to locate suppliers of mobile field hospitals suitable for military use. They were very interested in equipment that could stand up in rough terrain. Razmara said this never happened. "I'm sorry to say that I have to deny it 100%, he said. Isn't that amazing? Absolutely amazing that this stuff did not come out in the Iran-Contra investigations and reports, which I've read thoroughly. Bush said at office, a well-to-do Baltimore businessman, Edwin Hochstedt, told Herald reporters during 3 separate interviews that he saw Vice President Bush in the foyer of TGS office suite at 1600 Wilson Boulevard in Arlington. "I saw them, Bush and Razmara, together. I guess it was a meeting," said Hochstedt, who described himself as a long-time friend of Razmara, who often visited the TGS offices. Hochstedt said he couldn't remember when during the past 5 years he saw the Vice President at the office, and he didn't know why Bush was there. He happened to be in one of the waiting rooms, no questions about it. Hochstedt said he also believes there's a connection between TGS and the CIA. "It is certainly an asset of the CIA," he said. 3 other sources told the Herald that Razmara told them at various times he has a relationship with Bush and that Bush has visited TGS headquarters. Hall, the former CIA officer, said Razmara promised during a meeting in 1985 to arrange an appointment with Bush. Hall had investigated the 1983 bombing of the US Embassy in Beirut as part of a CIA team. He said he wanted to convey to Bush information about the bombing that he believed the CIA was keeping from the White House. Isn't this an amazing additional information that complements what happened with Pan Am 103? He, Razmara, said, "I will ask for a meeting with Bush," Hall told the Herald. Dietz said Razmara often claimed that Bush visited the TGS offices. He said he was present with Hall when they say Razmara promised to get Hall an appointment with Bush. And so now, the article goes on, Bush flatly denies ever being in the TGS building, according to his aides. They didn't get him on camera and record it, but take a comment from his aides. They said the Vice President does not recognise Razmara's name and has not seen TGS President Shackley in 8 years. Can you believe this crap? He, Bush, has never been to the TGS office, said Bush aide Craig Fuller. The name Razmara is not familiar to him. Unbelievable. Ted Shackley, Razmara, fly to Hamburg, Germany to meet with manager Gorbanafar to negotiate the hostages for missiles deal. Razmara's the former head of SAVAK in Egypt when George Bush Sr.'s director of CIA, working with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley and Frank Turple. And his father is the former Prime Minister of Iran. And George Bush sets the business opportunity with the Kuwait royal family for Ted Shackley's company, TGS, with the Kuwait royal family directly. Personally, George Bush arranges that. It is an undeniable lie. State Department officials didn't act on the request for medical equipment that included Castlejohn's letter. Whaley said at about the same time at North's direction enters Robert Owen. Robert Owen was hired as a State Department consultant to help disperse the humanitarian aid funds. So now we've got Robert Owen from Robert Gray and Company now appearing on the scene and responsible for the distribution of this humanitarian aid to the Iran-Contras. The expenditure of those funds is currently the focus of one of the broadest investigations of the Iran-Contra scandal. What rubbish. Herald staff writer Louis Feld, Soto, Guy Gugulato and Mark Silver also contributed to this report. It then goes on and says that medical care problems. The letter provided a channel of communications that was valuable, especially at a time when our government couldn't be upfront, said Whaley. I know that Oliver North set up a lot of out-of-office lieutenants in different parts of the intelligence community, most of which were retired to go out and clear a lot of this, to find the donations, to pass the word that now is the time to come to the aid of the President, Whaley said. When Castlejohn travelled to Washington in the spring of 1985, several groups were concerned about the Contras' meagre medical and surgical facilities. Morale was sagging because of primitive medical facilities near the combat areas in Nicaragua, according to a report prepared at the time by Dr. Vern Cheney of the prestigious Dooley Foundation. Cheney said his report was paid for by Singlaub, the retired Army Major General, who was chairman of the US Council for World Freedom. So here's another one. He's got Wackel and now he's got the US Council for World Freedom. For Singlaub. Cheney said he didn't meet Castlejohn, but he did meet Whaley. It was known at the time, Cheney said, that $27 million in US humanitarian aid for Nicaragua would soon be available. Oliver North, his associates, Rob Owen, Singlaub, Whaley, and a group of Latin doctors were preparing various proposals to obtain funds for medical equipment and supplies, he said. Owen is currently under investigation in connection with allegations that some of the humanitarian aid money was diverted to purchase of combat supplies and ammunition for the Contras. And more details are revealed. Bush sent Doctor to North. It says Castlejohn said he travelled twice to Washington in addition to the briefings of the White House, which North was present. Castlejohn attended a meeting at the downtown Washington Hotel at which Singlaub and Contra leader Adolfo Calero were present, Whaley said. Castlejohn said he doesn't recall meeting Calero or Singlaub. Singlaub could not be reached for comment. Calero did not return calls from the Herald. Kenneth R. Dietz, a Maryland businessman who said he was a private security consultant in 1985, also told the Herald that he attended the hotel meeting with Castleton and Whaley and approximately 6 others. He said he saw both CASOLARO and Singlaub in the Washington hotel meeting room. I was present at the meeting in Washington at the hotel, and General Singlaub was there, Dr. Castleton was there, Adolfo Calero was there, and Hank Whaley was there, Dietz said. Whaley, working with Castleton and the consulting firm Birch and Davis Associates Inc. of Silver Spring, eventually helped produce a report for submission to State Department seeking purchase of millions of dollars worth of medical equipment from the $27 million earmarked for non-lethal aid to Contras. And then the consultant's report. The report included a detailed shopping list of mobile field hospital units, ultralight evacuation aircraft. A copy of the report obtained by the Herald also includes Bush's letter to Castleton in a section describing Castleton's professional background and accomplishments. Dr. David R. Boyd, a trauma specialist from Marion, said he prepared the report for Whaley while Boyd was a member of the consulting firm Birch and Davis Associates. He said Whaley had asked him to quickly put a report together on the availability of medical equipment requested by Castleton. He said he didn't meet Castleton but understood that he had credibility in Latin America. He recalled Castleton's letter from Bush being flashed around but said he didn't think that was significant. And then more details are now revealed. It was kind of a spooky deal, Boyd said. There was this $27 million that had to be spent suddenly. Boyd said his Project Lifeline report, dated May 1985, never received funding, nor was he paid for the report. He said he didn't know what happened to it, and after he spent approximately 1 month to complete the report for Whaley, before it was submitted for funding, a copy of the report was hand-delivered to Virginia firm TGS International Limited, according to Whaley and Dietz, the former security consultant. TGS is an Arlington firm whose name is the initials of the president, Theodore Shackley, retired CIA agent. And so the letter with the vice president's seal and its reference to Jeb Bush made it possible to channel Castleton into the shadow administration's pipeline in Washington, according to former arms dealer Henry H. Whaley, who introduced Castleton to members of North's network. It's got here, it's repeating a little bit there, but it says that Whaley, now a Maryland attorney, introduced Castleton to a group of doctors, then working with Oliver North's top aide, Robert Owen, to get the US funds to ship badly needed combat medical supplies to the Contras. Castleton's ability to open a new shipping route through Guatemala made him a potentially valuable member of the group. Whaley said, "If you can move band-aids, you can move bullets," he said. Isn't that a lovely saying? If you can move band-aids, you can move bullets, he said. Whaley, a former Marine official, said he made the first contacts in the shadow government when he worked as an arms dealer. He said his contra aid proposal for medical equipment was never funded and Castleton's routes was never used to ship arms. Whaley escorted Castleton to meetings in Washington attended by Adolfo Calero, retired Army Major General John K. Singlaub, and others working with Robert Owen. Castleton said he also attended earlier briefing White House where he said he met Oliver North. And it says here, since the Iran-Contra scandal broke, Bush has refused to answer questions directly from the Herald reporters about allegations that he and his staff were actively involved in North's covert efforts to assist the Contras. A Bush spokesman said in November, "We knew nothing about what was going on down there in Central America." What rubbish. The Herald's 2-month investigation of the Bush letter followed a trail from Guatemala City to Miami and Washington. The letter was eventually placed by Whaley in a report together with Castleton's lists of needed medical supplies and sent by Whaley, according to Herald sources, to a mysterious Virginia company. So this is a second report that they're doing. That company is headed by Ted Shackley. Reconfirming top CIA official who served as chief of covert operations when Bush headed CIA in 1976. It says the vice president has visited the offices of Shackley's firm, sources have told the Herald, in on-the-record interviews. Bush aides and Shackley denied that Bush has ever visited, had contact with the firm TGS International Limited. The firm never handled the Castleton report, a TGS official repeated. Well, I believe our journey, our secret team that sets up the Cercle 6I, a privately funded secret intelligence agency that knows no borders, linked to the Knights of Malta, the P2 Lodge and Opus Dei, with their links with the banks, the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, Guggenheim Bank and BCCI, are not loyal to the USA, and it's about money laundering, it's about economic warfare, yes, to fight communism, but it's about a secret banking network, a black market for an international arms and drugs trade link across all borders. I remember in my interview with Jimmy Rothstein, when he received the telephone call from Pope Paul I, asking him that he wants to appoint him to investigate evidence of the pedophiles in the Catholic Church that were destroying the church. The bishops, the archbishops that have been compromised, blackmailed. And to investigate the overwhelming evidence that the Vatican Bank and Banca Ambrosiano's massive fraud. He wanted to do a full audit and expose it and clean it up, and then mysteriously dies. He said to me, one thing you have to understand, you cannot move drugs from one country to another without permission. You have to have permission. And that reconfirms in his belief that there is an international cartel of bankers and elite individuals that are running a mafia coordinated higher level cartel to money launder the drugs through their banks and to finance terrorist activities, fascist, neo-Nazi groups in the name of fighting communism and perpetual capitalism for their elite control. And so we come back to Carlo Presenti. Who was he really? He was on the board of directors of 28 companies, managing director of Intermobiliare from 1955 to 1967. He was leader of a car manufacturer, Lancia, from 1955 to 1969. And Carlo had relationships with one of the biggest Italian industrial families. In 1960, he was on the board of directors of 38 companies. He was honoured by Italy's president as a Knight of the Order of Labour Merit in 1962. Carlo Presenti was a large contributor to Avanguardia Nazionale, founded by Stefano Delle Chiari in early 1960s. Now this is phenomenal. He's head of this secret Catholic group. He's endorsed and in partnership with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, to to establish, and Zabrinsky to set up the Trilateral Commission. And he was the vice president of Banco Ambrosiano when it collapsed in 1982. He's a leader in deep politics in Italy and attended Le Cercle. In his autobiography, David Rockefeller refers to Le Cercle as the Presenti Group and states that he first learned of its existence in October 1967 when he was invited to join by Carlo Presenti. And hence our journey starts. And here is the press release in 1984. The Italian financier suspected in Vatican Bank collapse was 77. Italian financier Carlo Presenti. He died in Canada Thursday, 1984, one day before he was to appear in court on charges of stemming from the collapse of an Italian bank with connections to the Vatican Bank. Don't you just love it? Robert Calvi dies. Michele Sindona dies. And Carlo Presenti dies one day before he's due to appear in court. Presenti, president of both holding company Intermobiliare and Italy's leading cement producing company Italcementi, died in Montreal's General Hospital of a heart attack. He was 77. It sounds like the CIO flu to me. In March 1982, Presenti was declared the largest shareholder of Banco Ambrosiano when Italy's largest private bank. 3 months later, Ambrosiano collapsed and its president, Robert Calvi, was found hanged from a bridge in London. Don't you just love it? You're going to commit suicide, so rather than do it in Italy, you fly on a plane to London and then climb down and have some bricks in your pocket and then hang yourself from the London Bridge. Isn't it just beautiful? I'm going to do a podcast because I'll show you who really arranged that flight and their links with the Nazis and with one of the directors of BCCI. Presenti and 11, and by the way, the same person, and the director of BCCI, through my research on him, that's how I discovered that Oliver North, Dwayne Claridge, CIA were using Roy Frankhauser from the Ku Klux Klan and American Nazi Party to set up all the BCCI accounts for a Mossad agent, Paul Leah Alexander, to be the biggest cocaine distributor worldwide for Noriega and also Pablo Escobar through Brazil into the USA and Australia. He trafficked over $8 billion of cocaine throughout the 80s and 90s, hidden in Siemens transformers, whilst acting as a DEA informant. And so this is the proof that Roy Frankhauser was working with CIA, NSC, with Oliver North, Ted Shackley's team, Dwayne Claridge, and he even had an office in Langley with the CIA Counter-Terrorism Centre. And he set up all the BCCI accounts. And Roy Frankhauser was the key person that destroyed Lyndon LaRouche, which I'll touch on in this podcast. And so it turns out Presenti and 11 other people were charged with aiding and abetting the purchase of more than 1 million Ambrosiano shares, some of which ended in portfolio of a company called that Presenti headed. Presenti was also under investigation in a huge loan the Vatican Bank made to Intermobiliare, the Institute of Religious Works. The formal name of the Vatican Bank lent 50 billion lira, $30 million US, at current exchange rates to Intermobiliaire in 1972. So as you can see, the relationship and the Cercle and the leader of this secret group with the P2 Lodge and the Catholic orders of MALTA and Opus Dei, the Cercle 6I, began in the 70s and really got initiated under President Nixon with Kissinger and Haig and Ted Shackley and Michael Ledeen. And so it now says investigators are now trying to find out why Intermobiliaire repaid the Vatican Bank 160 billion lira. Don't you like that? It lent 50 billion lira from the Vatican Bank, but it repaid 160 billion lira, more than 3 times the original loan in 1979. The American who serves as the bank president, Archbishop Paul Masinkas, don't you like it, the Vatican Bank, is also being investigated in connection with the loan. News of Presenti's death had not reached Italy when the hearing on the sale of Ambrosiana shares opened Friday morning. A defence lawyer working for financiers told judges his client was not present because of serious illness. Presenti had been undergoing treatment for a heart trouble in Montreal for several days. The financier, a native of northern city of Bergamo, had survived an earlier heart attack. And here is confirmation of his links with Trilateral Commission and Le Cercle, and his links with Stefano Delle Chiari, and as Vice President of Banco Ambrosiano, and his links with David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, to set up the Trilateral Commission with Brzezinski. And here's the group that he was financing, an Avanguardia Nazionale, organised the assassination of Italian magistrate Vittorio Ocasio, employing arms supplied by, here we go, CIA, via its contacts in Francoist Spain, where Otto Cazzini was based. For the killing, Pierluigi Contutelli is currently serving a life sentence in Italy. Avanguardia Nazionale member Mario Ricci participated to the 1978 assassination of Agala, the Itara who had taken part 5 years before in the assassination of Francisco Franco's Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco. We are talking about Kissinger and Rockefeller and Zabriskie in league with Carlo Presenti, representing a secret Catholic order with the Cercle, 6I, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and P2 Lodge, financing neo-Nazi assassinations, linked back to Otto Cazzini from the SS Nazis assassination team. And so if you go and have a look more at the history of National Vanguard and its links with neo-fascist, neo-Nazi groups in Italy, it turns out that it was founded by Stefano Delle Chiari, Italian social movement known as MSI, and it was really a radical group to spearhead a social movement, preferring instead to work outside the political system, subvert democracy, and bring about a return to fascism. So we're talking about a fascist. A leaflet produced by the group described them as in favour of man-to-man engagements, in which their members were to be encouraged to be as ruthless as possible. Members of the movement were frequently denounced as terrorists, and it was claimed that Delle Chiari had links to bomb-making concerns in Spain. And this link with Spain, with Otto Scazzini, is going to be critical given the fascist links of terrorism directly back to Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, and their team, but endorsed, supported, and embraced by Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and Zabriskie. Now, the group also had close links with Ordine Nuova and other extremist groups. It says Vincenzo Vinesegura was a notorious member of the group. The group was responsible for a series of bomb attacks in Italy in 1969, the most notorious of which was called the Piazza Fontana bombing. The group also took a leading role in the abortive coup attempt by Junio Valerio Borges the following year. So we're talking about Carlos Presenti is financing this. And here's the proof. In Spain, Della Che linked up with the right-wing extremists from other European countries, including Otto Scazzini, a former Nazi, and Yves Guérin Sirac, a French former officer of the illegal organisation Army Secret, OAS, and Gladio-linked leader, here we come to Operation Gladio, of the Portugal-based CIA front Aguinta Press. Otto Scazzini was employed by Franco's secret service as a security consultant, then hired Dali Chiari to target opponents of Franco in both Spain and abroad, whereupon Dali Chiari carried out well over 1,000 bloodthirsty attacks, including an estimated 50 murders. Can you believe this? Can you believe that Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller and Zabriskie, and the cast here are embracing Carlo Presenti, who runs this secret Catholic church group called Sint Unum. And then they set up the Trilateral Commission with him. So the link now is definitive. The 6i, Le Cercle, Ted Shackley's groups, Michael Ledeen, and the parties involved with Le Cercle, 6i, P2 Lodge, under the guise of a holy alliance with the Vatican, with the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, are really financing and working with Otto Scazzini. And so a secret war in Spain was characterised by assassinations and acts of terror. Members of Dali Chiari's secret army, including Italian right-winger Aldo Tisai, later confessed to Italian magistrates that during the Spanish exile they had tracked down and killed anti-fascists on behalf of the Spanish Secret Service. And so further research shows that Stefano Dali Chiari was an Italian neo-fascist terrorist. He was a close friend of Lucio Gelli, Grand Master of the P2 Masonic Lodge. He was suspected of involvement in South Americans' Operation Condor, but was acquitted. He was known by the nickname Il Caccola, Roman slang for shorty, as he was 5 feet tall, although he stated that originally the nickname came from his very young involvement at age 14 in the Italian social movement MSI, a neo-fascist political party established after the war. In South America, he took part in cocaine coup of Luis Garcia Meza Tejada, when a notorious corrupt military regime forced its way to power in Bolivia. And so now we're really getting into the Nazi territory now. And so we're talking about Klaus Barbie in 1980, with existence from the Argentine side, which SIDE, which had been called on for the 70 foreign agents. He later worked for a new government in training of its soldiers. He also met in Madrid with Pinochet during Franco's funeral in 1975, beginning his involvement with the Chilean regime and his part in Operation Condor, according to lawyer Alon Jones, representative of the Spanish justice during Spain's request to Great Britain for the extradition of Augusto Pinochet. Pinochet met with Deli Chiari in Madrid to plan an attack against Carlos Altamirano, the leader of the Chilean Socialist Party. The plan failed either because Altamirano's awareness and personal caution, or because some intelligence agency, is not known from which country, may have made him aware of the threats on his personal life. According to Le Monde Diplomatique, Deli Chiari met with Abdullah Katli in Latin America and during a visit of Turkish grey wolves member in Miami in September 1982. I want you to remember the grey wolves because that's going to come up in the next coming parts of my podcast. So here is the link with the grey wolves. Through the financing of Carlo Presenti, Abdullah Kati is reckoned to have been one of the main perpetrators of the underground operations carried out by the Turkish branch of the Gladio organisation and had played a key role in bloody events of the period 1976 to 1980, which paved the way for the military coup d'etat of September 1980. During the 1997 hearing before the Commission on Terrorism, headed by Senator Giovanni Pellegrino, Stefano Deli Chiari went on speaking about a black fascist international and his hopes of creating the conditions of an international revolution. He talked about World Anti-Communist League, WACL, by John Singlaub, but said that after attending a meeting in Paraguay, he left it. He claimed that the latter was a front for the CIA, so he confirmed that it was a front for the CIA. He only admitted having taken part in New European Order, NOE, organisation, and denied having worked with the International Anti-Communist Alliance around 1974. According to CIA documents in Madrid, Deli Chiari also met with Michael Townley, a DINA agent, and Virgilio Paz Romero, a Cuban based in Miami with a connection in Chile, to prepare with the help of Franco's secret police the murder of Bernardo Leighton, a Chilean Christian Democrat. On 6th of October 1975, Leighton and his wife were severely injured by gunshots while in exile in Rome. Deli Chiari, along with fellow neo-fascist Vincenzo Vinesegura, also testified in Rome in December 1995 before Judge Mario Savini di Cuburi that Heinrich Anosabia Clavel, a former Chilean secret police agent prosecuted for crimes against humanity in 2004, and Michael Townley were directly involved in this assassination. This is unbelievable evidence of our Le Cercle, 6i, P2 Lodge and Holy Alliance with the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei. Otto Johann Anton Skorzeny was an Austrian-born German SS, Obernsturmbannführer, Lieutenant Colonel in the Waffen-SS during World War II. During the war, he was involved in a number of operations, including the removal of power of Hungarian Regent Miklos Horthy and Grand Sasso raid, which rescued Benito Mussolini from captivity. Skorzeny led Operation Greece, in which German soldiers infiltrated Allied lines by using their opponents' uniforms, equipment, luggage and customs. So his rescue of Mussolini was a daring rescue attempt using a plane, and they were able to have him removed and returned to Italy. As a result, he was later in 1947 charged at the Dachau Military Tribunal with breaching the 1907 1907 Hague Convention, but was acquitted after a former British SOE agent, FFE Yeo Thomas, testified that he and his operatives had been prepared to open fire while wearing German uniforms behind enemy lines. Mysteriously, Corzini escaped from an internment camp in 1948, hiding out in Bavarian Farm, as well as Salzburg and in Paris, before eventually settling in Francoist Spain. In 1953, he was offered a job as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, which he did not take up. He was an advisor to Argentinian President Juan Perón, and in 1963, Skorzeny was allegedly recruited by the Mossad and conducted operations for the agency. Skorzeny died of lung cancer on the 5th of July 1975 in Madrid at the age of 67. The link of the secret Catholic orders through Carlo Presenti with Nazi, neo-Nazi groups and also neo-fascist groups, with their links direct to Otto Skorzeny, confirms without doubt the role that Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Frank Turple, Thomas Kleins, Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig and CIA were involved with financing these radical groups, fascist groups, to undermine social left governments being elected in all countries worldwide. If we go further with Otto Skorzeny, there seems to be overwhelming evidence that he was also recruited to work for Mossad, not willingly, as he feared that they were going to assassinate him, but he agreed to assist them with assassinations. And so there's overwhelming evidence that the Israeli Security Intelligence magazines, in an article claiming that Skorzeny had been recruited by Mossad in 1963 to obtain information on German scientists who were working on an Egyptian project to develop rockets to be used against Israel. It says, reporting on the Matara story, the major Israeli daily newspaper said that it confirmed the story from their own senior Mossad source. Former Mossad head Issa Harel confirmed the story that former Nazis were recruited to provide intelligence on Arab countries. Ian Black and Benny Morris wrote in 1991 that Skorzeny may not have known for whom he was working, but in 2010, Tom Segvev published in his biography of Simon Wiesenthal that Skorzeny had offered to help only if Wiesenthal removed him from his list of wanted war criminals. Wiesenthal refused, but Skorzeny finally agreed to help anyway. Segev gave as his main source the senior Mossad agent Rafi Maiden, to whom Segev attributes the primary role in the recruitment of Skorzeny. Further details of the story were published by Yoshi Melman and Dan Raviv in 2016. According to their information, a Mossad team had started to develop a plan to kill Skorzeny, but Chief Issa Harel decided to attempt to recruit him instead, as a man on the inside would greatly enhance their ability to target Nazis, who were providing military assistance to Egypt. He allegedly was recruited and conducted operations for Mossad from 1964, working with Avraham Hahitvid and Rafi Eitan. Now, don't you just love this? We now have the link to Rafi Eitan through the recruitment of Otto Skorzeny, being financed and working with Italian fascists and neo-Nazi groups in Italy and in Spain, who are all financed by Carlo Presenti who is the founder of the Trilateral Commission with Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and Zabriskie, and also involved in financing and supporting the Cercle and 6i, a private security agency that transcends all borders and can bypass restrictions of governments on their agencies, such as CIA, to undertake domestic spying activities and also perhaps even assassinations, political assassinations, physical assassinations, or dirt programs to blackmail senior politicians and business leaders worldwide. So we now have Rafi Hayton, who is identified as receiving the PROMIS software in the financial trail and links and support with this the Cercle 6i with our secret team. In 1981, Carlo Presenti was also personal friends with Lucia Gelli. In 1981, raid the propaganda Dewey P2 list. Gelli's downfall started with banker Ambrosiano scandal, which led to a 1981 police raid on his villa and the discovery of the P2 covert lodge. On March 17, 1981, a police raid on his villa led to the discovery of a list of 962 persons composed of Italian military officers, civil servants, including the heads of 3 Italian secret services, involved in propaganda Dewey known as P2, a clandestine lodge expelled from the Grand Orient d'Italia Masonic organisation. Among these were Michele Sindona, a banker with clear connections to the mafia, has been clearly associated with P2. In 1972, Sedona purchased controlling interests in Long Island's Franklin National Bank. 2 years later, the bank collapsed. Convicted in 1980 in the USA, he was mysteriously extradited back to Italy. 2 years later, he was poisoned in his cell while serving a life sentence. The P2 membership list was authenticated, with a few exceptions, by a 1984 parliamentary report in Italy. So now, one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission, with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and Zabriskie, was personal friends with Lucia Gelli and the P2 Lodge. Carlo Presenti was also the vice president of banker Ambrosiano. And so we now have a direct link of Kissinger, Rockefeller, banker Ambrosiano with the Cercle and 6i Trilateral Commission to the whole of the Vatican Bank and banker Ambrosiano money laundering of drugs and weapons worldwide. Lucia Gelli was the Masonic worshipful master of the powerful Italian lodge Propaganda Dewey P2, involved in Gladio's strategy of tension. So we really do have definite links to terrorist activities, linked back to NATO, forces left behind as the strategy was, and with Alexander Haig being the head of NATO Europe, before being appointed across to work with Nixon right through to becoming the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. He has been involved in almost all of the Italian scandals in the past decades. Tangentopoli, which led to Mani Pulite anti-corruption operation, Gladio, stay behind clandestine NATO structure, Banco Ambrosiano scandal, Italian Premier Aldo Moro's 1978 murder, and Jelly was also a member of the Knights of Malta. So now we come to the importance of Michael Ledeen. Lucia Jelly was directly linked to Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. The evidence is overwhelming. After World War II, after the Second World War II, Jelly purportedly joined the CIA on the recommendation of the Italian Secret Service, a hypothesis yet to be verified. However, he was closely connected by Edward Herman to Michael Ledeen. So Edward Herman is a researcher and author from the University of Pennsylvania, and his research ties him directly to Michael Ledeen, who is thought by many to be a close collaborator or agent of CIA. Michael Ledeen is very close to Italian intelligence, also CIA, and also Mossad. I believe he's a triple agent, not a double agent, but a triple agent. In any case, he has been a collaborator of English intelligence agencies and Americans. He joined the neo-fascist MSI, this is Lucio Jelly, which gave him parliamentary immunity. As headmaster of propaganda jury, Jelly assumed a major role in Gladio's strategy of tension in Italy starting from 1969, the Piazza Fontana bombing. Gladio was a clandestine stay-behind operation sponsored by the CIA and NATO to counter communist influence in Western European countries, which has been involved in terrorist false flag operations in Italy. However, the Gladio affair has been treated, including by the courts, as having no sensible connection with the P2 affair. In 1994, P2 members were acquitted of charges of conspiracy against the state. As you know, my book says you can only control governments when you control justice and the media. We are talking about an order called the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, that transcends all international borders, and their loyalty is not to nations, it's to fellow members. And it's no surprising that there is many judges, many politicians, many military commanders who are members of the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and the P2 Lodge. So it's no surprise when there's no evidence and no charges. It seems to be the common thread that runs across every government royal commission in Australia and every Senate and congressional hearing in the United States, that no one's prosecuted and the evidence that is damning is never made public. And so it says here that Lucia Jelly's downfall started with Banca Ambrosiano scandal, which led to a 1981 police raid on his villa and discovery of the P2 covered lodge. Michael Ledeen role, and this is key, this theme will keep coming through. Michael Ledeen's role in the Billy Gate affair. And I want you to remember this important part, because it's going to be relevant to everything that comes up with Banca Ambrosiana, the Vatican, the popes, and things do not happen by chance. Michael Ledeen's role in the Billy Gate affair. Various sources have repeated charges that far from merely reporting on Billy Carter's meeting in Libya, Ledeen collaborated with Italian intelligence sources to use Billy Carter's ill-conceived trip to Libya, brother of President Carter, Jimmy Carter, to create an influence peddling scandal. With the illicit support of SISMI, in collaboration with well-known American Italianist Michael Ledeen, Pazienza succeeded in extorting, also using fraudulent means, information then published with great evidence in an international press on the Libyan business of Billy Carter, the brother of then President of the United States. From the indictment of Francesco Pazienza, as reported in Tale of Intrigue, how an Italian ex-spy who also helped US landed in prison here, Jonathan Whitney, the Wall Street Journal, August 7th, 1985, states, Sesame was the architect of the scandal over Billy Carter, and that the material in this case was gathered mostly by Pazienza and by his American friend Michael Ledeen. The Rise and Fall of the Bulgarian Connection, published by Edward S. Herman, as I mentioned to you. This is the confirmation of the link of Michael Ledeen. Frank Broadhead, Sheridan Square Publications, 1986. Pazienza was ultimately indicted in an Italian court with Ledeen as an unindicted co-conspirator for luring President Carter's brother Billy into a compromising relationship with Gaddafi during the 1980 presidential campaign. The Iran-Contra connection, secret teams and covert operations in Reagan era by Jonathan Marshall, Peter Dale Scott, Jane Hunter, 1987, state, La Espresso repeats charges that Pazienza and Ledeen collaborated with Sesame in investigating Billy Carter's dealing with Libya prior to the 1980 elections. Cable from US Embassy, Rome, October 30, 1984. So I did some searches on Edward Samuel Herman, and he's an American economist, media scholar and social critic. And Herman is known for his media criticism. And I didn't know about this gentleman, Professor, but it substantiates the theme of the 6I, the PROMIS affair, software affair, is that you only control governments when you control justice and you control the media. And so Herman is known for his media criticism, in particular his propaganda model hypotheses, developed with Noam Chomsky, a frequent co-writer with him. He held an appointment as a professor emeritus of finance at the Wharton School of Business, isn't that interesting, of the University of Pennsylvania, and a media analyst with a speciality in corporate and regulatory issues as well as political economy. He also taught at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Ideologically, Herman has been described as a dedicated radical Democrat, an ideology which opposes corporate control in favour of direct democracy while distancing itself from other radical movements. His writings frequently dealt with the manner in which Western corporate media report on violent regional conflicts, disputing those reports to an extent that his critics described as genocide denial. But what did he propose? Edward Samuel proposed a propaganda model in his publication. And this is really what the Cercle and 6I was spearheading as a private organisation, employing propagandists. As you can recall, I mentioned to you that Fritz Kramer was really the expert on propaganda. And so the Cercle and recruits Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, and of course links across with all the areas of propaganda through the CIA and NSC. And much of Herman's scholarship was focused on developing the propaganda model to explain how market forces, internalised assumptions and self-censorship motivate newspapers and television networks to stifle dissent. Don't you love that? Market forces, internalised assumptions and self-censorship motivate newspapers and television networks to stifle dissent. Rather than needing direct control over the media as dictatorships, industrial democracies control popular opinion using filters, which prevent politically controversial ideas from reaching the public. Their censorship is through filters. Kronsky and Herman specified 5 filters. In particular, the concentration of media ownership, hence CIA, NSC, acquisitions through discrete covert funding, owned the media barons, or the media barons work for them. And few corporations, the need to please advertisers and funding sources, the reliance on government, provided sources, flack, and anti-communist ideology. So repeating again, the 5 filters: concentration of media ownership to a few corporations. It's exactly the strategy they use for controlling the drug trade. They eliminate all competitors and control the chosen few. And that's what CIA was doing with Lucien Conein at DEA Intelligence. The need to please advertisers and funding sources, they're the filters. The reliance on government, there's another filter. You need government support, either to get access to those at White House, or you don't get in. Provided sources. So that's what it says, the reliance on government provided sources. Flack, that you receive flack for what you publish. And anti-communist ideology. These influences combine to prevent politically inconvenient knowledge and ideas from ever reaching the general public. I think Edward Samuel Herman, identifying Michael Ledeen, his credibility is second to none, but more important, he understands what Michael Ledeen does. And Walter Remand with NSC and the CIA propaganda, Project Democracy. I found this book by Edwin Herman, The Rise and Fall, The Bulgarian Connection. And he says, on May 13th, 1981, Mehmet Ali Agca, Turkish fascist, leading member of the notorious Grey Wolves. I told you to remember Grey Wolves. And convicted murderer shot Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. It turns out that Edward Herman's pretty switched on. He's worked out what Michael Ledeen really does. And now he's got a book exposing who is Mehmet Ali Agca, Turkish fascist who shot John Paul II. Agca was one of the most wanted terrorists in the world. He had been found guilty in 1979 murder of progressive Turkish newspaper editor Abdi Apeki, but had escaped from prison with Grey Wolves' help. Agca was hurriedly convicted of the attempted assassination of the Pope amidst dark rumours of conspiracy. For more than a year, the prisoner was seen by the world as just what he appeared to be, a right-wing Muslim fanatic who had threatened once before to kill the Pope and who had finally attempted the deed on behalf of the Grey Wolves Brotherhood. So he's now able to identify the link of Michael Ledeen, and also he's linking this assassination and homing in on the Grey Wolves Brotherhood. But suddenly some Western journalists, led by a former CIA chief of propaganda, claimed that Agca was in fact an agent of the Bulgarian government. So here's an alternative proposal being put forward, and by the extension of the KGB hired to kill the Polish Pope because of his influence in troublesome Poland. This theory, for which there was no evidence, was soon bolstered by Agca's prison confessions. Confessions the authors of this book say he was coached by intelligence agencies to make. In the years which followed, the elaborate conspiracy theory, the Bulgarian connection, was voiced incessantly in the Western media. And guess who it was? CIA framed Bulgaria for Pope John Paul II assassination attempt. Report Politics Diplomacy, April 21 in 2011. Alexander Haig, then Secretary of State, had asked the CIA to find anything they could be used against the communists. The CIA knew the Grey Wolves had connections with Bulgaria through organised crime and that Agca had visited, so when he tried to kill the Pope, they were very smart and exploited the connection. Quote, Insaldo explains. And here's the next one. Michael Ledeen, an American foreign policy expert, supported the theory. In a series of articles in the New York Times and on NBS television network 1 year after the attack. So we've got Alexander Haig and Michael Ledeen proposing an alternative to the motivation of killing Pope John II, the attempted assassination. Mr. Insaldo also alleged that Italian Secret Service, in cooperation with CIA, forced Agca to confess to a Bulgarian connection, a confession the Turk later retracted. Isn't this propaganda? And why? Well, I've got here for Lyndon LaRouche's investigation on the Bulgarians, the link of Cercle, Shackley and Bush. And he says, the 1981 attempt on the Pope, what's behind the new polemics? But was it really necessary to prove Karadzhov's tale in order to indicate a line of investigation involving the two heads? An analysis published June 6 in the biggest and most authoritative Italian Catholic daily demonstrates the contrary. The revelations published these days are years old. The article points out, leading the reader into a tunnel that extends from Ali Agca not only to the KGB but also to George Bush. Two Americans had trained Agca, Edwin Wilson and Frank Cercle. Major Frank in Agca's confession. Two former CIA agents. The two exploited their experience giving classes in terrorism and sabotage to groups of would-be assassins, both right-wing and left-wing, Palestinians, agents of the Iranian Savak, secret police, and neo-fascist Turks. Don't you love this? The Iranian Savak, secret service. The training took place in Syria and Libya. Agca was trained there. So were they two defectors? So said the US government. But author Gordon Thomas, who dedicated years of investigation and 2 books to the story, came out with a different thesis. Frank Cercle at the CIA was one of Theodore Shackley's men, who was deputy chief of the CIA's 4 operations, known for having conducted in Cambodia and Vietnam a series of dirty activities from drug trafficking to political assassinations in which the CIA was not supposed to appear officially, and he did it with too much enthusiasm. Thus, under Carter's presidency, he was forced to resign together with 800 agents. They all went into private activities. LaRouche's article says the name of Frank Cercle had already come up several times in the Italian press. Last December, this is published in 1991, Mehmet Ali Agca, the Turkish killer, was interrogated again in jail in Rome by the magistrates investigating the attempt of Rosario Prior and Antonio Marino, and by two other magistrates investigating the kidnapping of two little girls whose families work at the Vatican, for whose ransom the abductors had demanded Agca's freedom. The terrorist was asked explicitly about Major Frank Cercle and the training he received from him in Libya. At the same time, the investigations moved to France, where also suddenly the accomplice of Agca in St. Peter's Square, Oral Selek, was located. The article says there is no lack of witnesses and connections once the political bloc is overcome. On May 13, anniversary of the attempt of the assassination of the Pope, called attention to the famous terrorist Maurizio Follini, a key supplier of weapons for the Italian Red Brigades from Libya. There is an international arrest warrant out for him for having shot an Italian judge for weapons trafficking, terrorist training in Libya, armed robbery. But when he was arrested in Athens in June 1987, all this was not enough to convince Greek magistracy to extradite him. The Italian magistrates wondered what kind of protection Follini might enjoy. Perhaps the same which allowed him to keep in contact with left-wing terrorists and KGB agents, but also right-wing terrorists like Grey Wolves and Ali Agca. In fact, Follini met Agca, a wanted terrorist who had stated public that he intended to kill the Pope, at the Hotel Vitosha in Sofia on July 5, 1980. Follini and a Turkish accomplice gave Agca a passport to enter Italy. Follini met Agca 2 or more times. He organised for Agca to go to training camp in Libya. Follini knows former CIA agent Frank Cercle, Agca's most important trainer. The last time Follini met Agca was in Perugia on April 17, 1981. Agca was with Teslantor, who according to the CIA is the go-between for the KGB and the Grey Wolves. On April 3rd, at a conference, a spokesman for the new Bulgarian president, Zeliv, and Professor Alan Weinstein of the Washington-based Center of Democracy announced the creation of a Center for Democracy Organized International Commission, which will examine the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. Weinstein will be given all the support he needs by the Bulgarian authorities. Already has received 36,000 documents. Weinstein is one of the founders of the, wait for it, National Endowment for Democracy, and many of the top CFD directors are closely intertwined with Project Democracy, under whose auspices Oliver North conducted his Iran-Contra shenanigans. The initiative to let a private organisation sponsored by people close to a specific part of the Anglo-American elite play the role of judges while there is still an open investigation in Italy cannot be considered totally proper. Isn't that an amazing indictment on the whole processes of transparency? It's the fox looking after the hen house. 1 week earlier, Papal Nuncio in Sofia, Monsieur Mario Rizzi, stated, "I never believed that the Bulgarian authorities were responsible for the attempt." And Cardinal Eduard Gagnon, one of the cardinals who knows best the Roman Curia, at a certain point one had the impression the confusion over the investigations was deliberate, was wanted by both sides. And Cardinal Silvio Odi, it was not in the plans of that time to find the culprits. Nobody was interested in changing the equilibrium reached in the relationships between the two superpowers. In 1982, Cardinal Oddi had received a letter from AGCA. Well, this article, Report Politics Diplomacy, April 2011. CIA framed Bulgaria for Pope John Paul II assassination attempt. And it does summarise. Wherever there is a cover-up, wherever there is a conspiracy, wherever there is evidence of the secret team's role in drugs, arms, Iran-Contra, BCCI fraud, Ambrosio form, or the assassination of attempted assassination of John Paul II. We have the same figures appearing. Michael Ledeen, Alexander Haig, and Ted Shackley. The same people who appeared around Danny Casolaro with his evidence of PROMIS, BCCI checks. The same people who appear when the US Customs is doing an investigation of Peter Vignics, who delivered the PROMIS software to Wackenhut for Michael Riconosciuto to modify for CIA and the secret team to infiltrate the banks. The SWIFT banking networks through the clearinghouses. Alexander Haig appears and shuts the investigation down. And then I have Robert Booth Nichols turn up, Michael Ledeen on the same day, with threats made against me, and my problems lead to Alexander Haig. And my research confirming his intimate relationships with Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, with the Cercle, 6i, and banker Ambrosiana. It's too much of a coincidence. And Michael Ledeen is a personal advisor to Ted Shackley and Alexander Haig. Given who is he, his education, what does he know, other than being a triple agent, working for CIA, Mossad, and Italian intelligence, with their links to the mafia for the distribution of arms and drugs worldwide. And so the tight-knit relationship of Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, Michael Ledeen, with the P2 Lodge with Lucia Jelly. Who is Michael Ledeen? This is taken from Edward Herman, The Terrorism Industry. Michael Ledeen has long been associated with CSIS, Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and is one of the founding organisers of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. I will be producing a full podcast on all the documentary evidence of the $2 billion brokers of death arms deal with Iran involving CIA, French intelligence, Mossad, and Noriega's drugs with Oliver North, and the key CIA agent who was sponsored by Michael Ledeen and JINSA to travel to Israel to personally meet with Rafi Eitan, is behind setting up and organising the whole $2 billion brokers of death arms deal. During the Reagan years, Ledeen moved into higher circles of power, serving as Secretary of State Haig's advisor and agent in Italy, and as a consultant on terrorism, and playing a role in both the Bulgarian connection case and the Iran-Contra affair. It's him, Michael Ledeen, who arranged for Ted Shackley to meet with manager Gorbanafar. During the 1970s, he worked as a journalist in Italy with Giornale Nuovo, a right-wing newspaper reportedly controlled by CIA. During the Italian stint, he collaborated regularly with Claire Sterling in anti-communist propaganda, closely tied to ongoing US interventionist strategies. In 1980, he entered into a collaboration with Francesco Pazienza, an agent of the Italian Secret Service, SISMI, and a member of Rome's extreme right-wing Masonic lodge P2 propaganda duo, headed by the fascist Lucia Gelli. In an Italian criminal court in 1985, Pazienza was judged guilty of political manipulation, forgery, and the protection of criminals and terrorists, among other offences. Indeed, according to the findings of the court, Pazienza falsified information about the Bologna bombing in order to divert attention away from the real right-wing terrorist who had staged the attack. Michael Ledeen is identified in the court documents as an agent of SISMI, possibly placed on their payroll by Pazienza himself. Michael Ledeen collected money for his services to SISMI, which included risk assessment, the training of Italian intelligence agents, and providing reports on terrorism to the Italian government. We now know from our research that he was doing that with Ted Shackley. And so, Iran-Contra tow missiles deal, A Spy for All Seasons by Dwayne Claridge, confirming the relationships of Michael Ledeen, manager Gorbanafar, Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig are intertwined directly into the Iran-Contra scandal. And so, Michael Ledeen and the Terror Network, My Life in the CIA, confirms that, and I've covered this before, is that he was pardoned by George Bush after being found guilty of his role and cover-up of the Iran-Contra affair, and he describes Michael Ledeen as a fine journalist, scholar and friend. He also said that CIA took a dim view of individuals such as Michael Ledeen and CIA officer Theodore Shackley, who freelanced with foreign intelligence services, which was Mossad, and SISMI, the Italian intelligence services. In 1980, Ledeen and Shackley teamed up, and there's the confirmation, to provide war games type training for European intelligence services, including Italy's intelligence service. So they did it for the European intelligence services as well, German, French, and others. He also confirms that Ledeen's damage to Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign by trumpeting of the Billy Gaddafi relation earned him the appreciation of Alexander Haig and other prominent Republicans. He also says that Ledeen further aggravated the CIA, becoming an official conduit between Haig and General Giuseppe Santovito, head of Italian military services, SISMI. And he also states it was his friend Ledeen who used his connections with prominent General Dynamics shareholders. Isn't that interesting? His reach. Mossad, Italian intelligence, CIA, and major investments in defence companies. So P2, fascist ideology, secret Masonic order, is the fabric holding Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig and Michael Ledeen and Lucia Gelli partnership. And so you can see why they're involved. Haig, Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley are intertwined into the Cercle and 6I, and the Holy Alliance, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, with P2 Lodge, using the Vatican Bank and Banca Ambrosiana for the money laundering of arms and drugs internationally. And this is the key: a meeting with Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger for Lucia Jelly. According to a November 18, 1990 article by The Observer, quoted by State Watch, declassified Secret Service papers reveal that Ted Shackley, Deputy Chief of CIA station in Rome in the 1970s, introduced the notorious Lucia Jelly, head of the neo-fascist P2 Masonic Lodge, for years as a fugitive in Argentina, to General Alexander Haig, then Nixon's Chief of Staff, and later, from 1974 to 1979, NATO's Supreme Commander. So, Ted Shackley's relationship with Michael Ledeen and Lucia Jelly goes back to the early 1970s. P2 was a right-wing shadow government ready to take over Italy that included 4 cabinet ministers, 3 intelligence chiefs, 48 MPs, 160 military officers, bankers, industrialists, top diplomats, and the army chief of staff. It's really everyone you need for a political coup. After meetings between Jelly, Italian ministry brass, and CIA men in the embassy, Gladio was given renewed blessing and more money by Alexander Haig, then head of the National Security Council, Henry Kissinger. So we now have the relationship of Lucia Jelly, P2 Lodge, with Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, and their support for Gladio is when it really all started. And so the involvement in Gladio's strategy of tension and the P2 scandal, in 1970 he was to arrest the president during a failed Golpe Borghese, with Avanguardia Nazionale founder Stefani Dali Chai and Francesco Pazienza, a SISMI officer. Lucia Jelly has been accused of the 1980 Bologna railway station bombing, which killed 85 persons and injured 200. Jelly has been implicated in Aldo Moro's murder, since the Italian chief of intelligence accused of negligence was a P2 member. The P2 Lodge did undoubtedly have certain paranoia given the public prominence of its members, and many observers still now consider it to be very strong. Many people today famous in Italy, standing from the top TV anchorman Maurizio Costanzo come from the P2. One of those associated with P2 was the presumed to be Michele Sindona, a banker with quite a clear connection to the mafia. And in 1972, Sindona purchased controlling interests of Franklin's National Bank. 2 years later, bank collapsed, convicted. He was mysteriously extradited to US and then died of poisoning in prison. Alleged involvement in CIA activities. This is the records on Lucia Jelly. In 1990, a report on television alleged that CIA had paid Jelly to instigate terrorist activities in Italy. Following this report, which also claimed that the CIA had been involved in the assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister, Olof Palme, then the President Francisco Cossiga requested the opening of the investigations, while the CIA itself officially denied these allegations. Critics have claimed that RAI report to be fraud because of the inclusion of the testimony of Richard Brunecki, who claimed to be a former CIA agent and made several declarations concerning October surprise conspiracy. Brunecki's background was also investigated by US Senate subcommittee, which dismissed Brunecki's claims as of a CIA employment. So given that they're denying that he was an employee, do you notice how this article goes further and says, well, just discount everything that Richard Brunecki says? In June 2020, the Swedish police closed their investigation into Olof Palme's assassination, assigning blame to Stig Enstrom, a Swedish graphic designer and centre-right municipal activist who was not affiliated with the CIA. Richard Brunecki made claims that he was employed by CIA. I have the court case of Chuck Hayes, his whole testimony in court confirming that he was an employee of CIA, and again, CIA denied that they had any relationship with him. For him to go into court making those allegations under oath and also was in communications with Danny CASOLARO and assisting him with his investigations of PROMIS, the PROMIS software, it seems like there's a common thread of CIA denying that certain people are assets. They may not be a direct employer, but they certainly were used as assets. And so the summary of Lucia Jalli and his ties with P2 Lodge, together with Le Cercle, 6i, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, the P2 Lodge. Summarise, he's a fascist volunteer in his youth. He is chiefly known for his role in the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. He was revealed in 1981 as being the venerable master of the clandestine Masonic propaganda duo P2 Lodge. He was born Tuscany during 1930s, volunteered for the Black Shirts, expeditionary forces sent by Mussolini in support of Francisco Franco's rebellion in the Spanish Civil War. He served as a liaison officer between the Italian government and Nazi Germany and participated in the Italian Social Republic with Giorgio Almirante, founder of the neo-fascist Italian social movement known as MSI. After a sales job with the Italian mattress factory, Permaflex, Jalli found his own textile importing company. It then confirms his involvement in failed coup and fugitive years in Argentina. And so without going through all of this, he was directly involved in activities in Argentina, failed coups, and it says that Jalli was affirmed that he was introduced Juan Perón to Masonry, and that his friendship was of real importance for Italy. He stated, "Perón was a Mason. I initiated him in Madrid." In June 1973, Jalli became the main economic and financial consultant of Isabel Perón and of José López Rega, the infamous founder of the Argentine anti-communist alliance known as AAA. During the 1970s, Jalli brokered three-way oil and arms deals between Libya, Italy, Argentina through the Agency for Economic Development, which he and Umberto Ortolani owned. So you can see the role, and his fingerprints are all over all activities in oil deals in Libya, Italy and Argentina. Hence Michael Ledeen and the Billy Carter scandal. On the run, Jalli escaped to Switzerland, where he was arrested in 1982 while trying to withdraw tens of millions of dollars in Geneva. Detained in modern Champdolin prison near Geneva, he managed to escape and then fled to South America in Pinochet's Chile. Finally, Jalli surrendered in 1987 in Switzerland to investigative judge Jean-Pierre Tremblay. He was wanted in connection with the 1982 collapse of Banco Ambrosiano on charges of subversive association in connection with the 1980 Bologna railway station bombing, which killed 85 people. He was sentenced to 2 months in prison in Switzerland, while an Italian court in Florence sentenced him on December 1987 in absentia, to 8 years in prison on charges of financing right-wing terrorist activity in Tuscany in 1970. Jelly had already been sentenced in absentia to 14 months in jail by a court in San Remo for illegally exporting money from it. What this shows, if you follow the story here, is that, as my book says, you only control governments when you control justice and the media. It seems that these people in this secret team, who are the highest orders of the Masonic orders of the P2 Lodge, the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, are actually protected by the judicial system from ever being prosecuted. Switzerland eventually agreed to extradite him to Italy, but only on financial charges stemming from the collapse of Banco Ambrosiana. In July 1988, he was absolved of charges of subversive association by a Bologna court, but was presented with a 5-year prison term for slander, having sidetracked the investigation into the 1980 bombing of Bologna train station. Stipulations connected to his extradition, however, prevented him from serving time. Isn't that amazing? 2 years later, an appeal court threw out Jelly's slander conviction. A retrial was ordered in October 1993. In 1992, Jelly was sentenced to 18 years, 6 months of prison after being found guilty of fraud concerning the collapse of Banca Ambrosiana. So, sentenced for 18 years. A black hole of $1.4 billion was found. The Vatican Bank, main shareholder of Banca Ambrosiana, consequently had a black hole of $250 million. This sentence of 18 years was reduced by a court of appeal to 12 years. The year 1992 also saw the beginning of the trial of 16 members of the P2 Masonic Lodge, which included charges of conspiracy against the state, espionage, and a revelation of state secrets. In April 1994, Jelly received a 17-year sentence for divulging state secrets and slandering the investigation, while the court threw out the charge that P2 members conspired against the state. Jelly's sentence was then reduced and he was placed under house arrest 2 years later. Don't you love it? You get... When you look at Paul Michael Riconosciuto, he's in prison for more than 30 years, nearly 30 years. When you look at other people who are serving prison, and this guy is getting 18 years and 6 months prison and then's released under house arrest 2 years later.